Well, we are here in Montague today with Roger Scharmer, and my name is Tanya Kabala, and I'm going to be one of the interviewers, and Margot Haynes is the primary interviewer. Oscar Osbo is doing the videography, and the interview is being conducted for the White Lake Environmental History Project. And do want to ask you, Roger, if you've read and signed the legal release.
I did.
Okay, thank you.
And our location?
Montague.
At Roger's house.
Yes. And Roger, Margot is going to be doing the majority of the questions, so take it over, Margot.
Well, we wanted to start by having you describe a little bit of family history in the White Lake. How did you come to be here?
Okay, I'm here because Mother's family was here. They're the O'Connell clan, and she was raised here in Montague. My father was from Muskegon, and we first years were spent in Muskegon, and then we moved up here in 1941. 1941 was the beginning of the war also, and so we sort of camped out in the old house for a while.
Do you have memories or information to share about White Lake prior to the onset of the chemical companies coming to town?
Oh, yeah. The situation was that we were here, but basically my mother's mother died, and so she was raised by an aunt, who was kind of my grandmother, Aunt Dolly O'Connell Flagstead, and the old O'Connell house was down in Maple Grove. And so I was somehow sent away every summer from about the third grade to maybe about the sixth to spend the summer down there in Maple Grove with the grandmother image, and which was right above the bathing beach and the water and things like that. And so you hung around the lake all the time. You could hear the dinner bell, the White Lake Villa, ding dong, that sort of thing. The tambourine whistle would go off at 7, 3:30 in the afternoon. And you built log rafts, and you hung around the water. You wore a bathing suit basically all summer long, slept on a front screen porch and things like that. It's very interesting. And then actually interesting, next door to old Aunt Dolly's place was a lady named Nan Taylor, and Nan Taylor was Bob Wesley's grandmother. And so you've known Bob Wesley, who was sort of one of the leaders with Went Dahlstrom in the whole kind of preservation movement or the conservation movement. Since childhood kind of thing. He and Ginny would sail up, and they would anchor a boat down below, sailboat down below. Rather colorful, interesting.
What are some early thoughts you had about the new chemical companies coming to the area? Can you describe what that was like?
Yeah, everybody was very enthused. There's some of the information I was talking about. It's just Montague, Michigan's $30 million chemical empire of the future. And then, the rise and fall of the lumber town. And then kind of goes on about White Lake, DuPont, etc. And that how Arthur Meyer, the well driller rig guy, discovered that there was salt down below, and that salt is what Hooker needed. And so slowly things have, he was it referred to him as basically a one-man chamber of commerce. He wrote a letter saying, we have salt, we have fresh water, etc. And so the movement sort of got going, and they thought about other locations like Grand Haven, Muskegon, etc. And somehow it's probably one of the wisest decisions that Muskegon ever made, that somehow Hooker didn't choose Muskegon. But anyway, they chose White Lake, and it sort of, the snowball just kind of goes on, and that we were in the doldrum basically because Adolf Anderson, the old banker, said it was like 50 years of lumbering, 50 years of slumbering, and now the awakening, and so this was going to be the greatest thing. And so you had this great chemical empire which is going to come, provide jobs. And then also it seems like everybody had been through the industrial era of Muskegon and during World War II. And so a job basically meant working in a very smog-filled foundry. You get emphysema, the working conditions are horrible, and then all of a sudden you had the opportunity for a clean industry to come to town, which would be Hooker. And and they were going to use, they needed water, which we had, they needed salt, which was down on the earth, and sort of away we go. So you have this movement starting, and there's photographs of Oscar, you can catch us later on, but like everybody from the banker Adolf Anderson to the meat man to the real estate guy are all very enthused, and so it just kind of kept going. And then the city of Montague had water. It didn't have a sewer system at that time, but they didn't need one. And then there was also an article here that when they came, the only people who were skeptical about it all were really the summer people. And I think that they had driven through Gary, Indiana, or Hammond, etc., on the way up here, and realized that chemical plants are not the nicest things in town. But somehow, there's an article here that says issues such as air and water pollution were brought into discussion. Water used in Hooker plant returns to the lake purer than it was before, and there is no air contamination. And so there was a total belief in the people who were beating the drum for the industry, and everyone was hungry, and they needed jobs. And so it's a pattern that basically can be repeated over and over again, and so we really have to be careful about how things work out.
Do you remember people saying anything else, maybe your parents or other people, other than what you've talked about?
Well, I was living in California. Actually, I'll backtrack a moment and say, my involvement with the chemical plants was basically like in 1952, I graduated from high school. And if you take the annual yearbook and open it up to the last page in the yearbook, the last page in the yearbook is a salt drilling well. And so basically this was the future, 1952. And so, and I probably could go through the graduating seniors and probably figure out how many people may have actually gone to work at Hooker. I can say that my first year of college summer, I came back and I worked on a survey crew with my father, who was surveying the land for DuPont and the chemical companies. And so, we surveyed all the old Dowie estate, we surveyed the Pack estate, we went actually right out to Lake Michigan, where the pipeline still goes out from DuPont into Lake Michigan, and did contour maps and things like that. And then I'm back to college kind of thing, and the next summer, basically they were now building Hooker, and so I worked 2 summers on construction, working for Hooker, and then the following 2 summers we're working on construction for DuPont. And it was really fascinating. I mean, you had a hard hat, and you wore goggles, and you had hard-toe shoes, and DuPont especially was they have a sign saying 365 days of accident-free days, and very proud of the fact that somehow they were like a non-killing industry, etc. And also you learned a lot in the construction field of just you kind of worked as kind of like a clerk, and you would have to keep hours and things like that. I did one for the electrical guy, a guy named Matheny, and you would do the field work and then get the hours, and then you have to take it up to headquarters, and you talk to the chain of command along the way, and it was a very interesting time, and it paid well.
Do you remember anything specifically that was said at that time while you were doing that? Or the people you were working with? Or?
They're a bunch of interesting people.
Well, I mean, for example, maybe were you friends or acquaintances with the summer people? Because I know there were a few people who raised concerns. The McFalls, they weren't summer people, but they were concerned because of where they lived, and you did mention that the summer people, seemed to have some concerns, but that's just.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the other thing, sort of like as I mentioned, I was sort of bored away during summertime down there in Maple Grove as a small kid, and then like when I was in high school, I went to work for Harry Pillinger down at Skipper's Landing next to the yacht club, and it was great because you learned how to paint, restore, refinish. Harry was an old PT boat commander, and sort of he was very, very vocal as to this or that, etc. Very interesting guy, and a lovely Stella, and so you kind of learned that end of the lake also because you hung around with that group down there, and It was back during the time when there was Lakeside Inn, Michelin to Beach Lodge, Murray's, and they would all have your kids from school, etc., working there in the slaves' quarters, and you would all get together, and there'd be a beach party, and on and on and on. It was a great time, and there were three of us. You got room and board, and you worked for 50 cents an hour. And in the shack, there was like Doug Byam, Roger Skillman, and myself. And every morning, there was a wonderful guy, Al Bernard, who was from Whitehall originally, and we would hear him walking up these wooden steps, and his first comment every day was like, "Get out of bed, you lazy bastards." And that was our greeting every morning kind of thing. And so that was old. He was a wonderful guy. He was sort of knew how to fix all kind of motors and things like that. And so you lived down there, and anyway, I did that all through high school, from like freshman year to senior year, and then I picked up on the construction jobs for Hooker, and etc.
Roger, I've got a question about Harry Pillinger. One of the interviews that's been done, or actually some of the materials on the project's website, reference Harry Pillinger when he was on city council, and really supported the Svensons when they were upset about the tannery odor. Do you have any knowledge of his activism or work on behalf of either citizens or relating to the tannery?
Harry was very outspoken, very upfront, and I actually lived in the town of Whitehall for a while, and then moved on down, to live basically over the store kind of thing, down over Skipper's Landing, and just sort of, precisely kind of what happens is that, like, okay, come 19, I graduate from college, I'm drafted into the Army. You're in the Army sends me to Kansas rather than sort of some glamorous spot, etc. And so I then realized that I have to do something else if I want to go do, study in Europe and things like that. And so after the Army was over, I came back and I worked as an assistant planner for the city of Muskegon for 2 years, 59 to 61. They had a requirement at that time that somehow if you worked for the city, you had to live in the city. And so I ended up buying sort of an old shack up on a hill in Bluffton, 3508 Wilcox, and just above the Bluffton School and Pierre Marquette Park, and did enough sort of sweat equity number on that, and that somehow then 2 years later, I then went to Europe. All right, took the money and left, and then spent the year living in Europe, studying architecture, landscape architecture, city planning, redevelopment, and also worked for a while over there, and then came back. So it's now 1962, and so virtually from 1962. I was gone. I was a part-time resident. I would come back here once a year to sort of check in on things and make sure things are going all right or whatever. So I would say Harry was very outspoken about a lot of things. And matter of fact, he was one of the people that when I think there was some hooker money that was a fine or something like that, which was given to the conservation department, and if they didn't use it, it could be build a marina in Saginaw or some other place, etc. And he insisted that somehow that money be spent on White Lake. He was very much a water man, and really an outstanding, amazing guy. Colorful. I've got some great Harry stories, but obviously one doesn't repeat them in public, I guess.
I'm aware that you're an avid kayaker now, and
Right.
I just wondered about your boating relationship with White Lake and when that started.
Oh, that started basically when I worked at Harry Pillinger's in high school. I bought an Old Town canoe. They had an old Town canoe come in, an old wooden canvas one. Needed a lot of work, and so I picked that up and then had that. And so you were always canoeing and up and down the lake, and you do things like go down to Lloyd's Landing with a buddy, etc., and you'd flip the canoe in and ride the northwest winds down to the channel, go through the channel, go to Murray's Inn and come back, the old channel kind of thing. So I've been out in the water a lot.
Yeah.
Michigan's all about water. I mean, what? I don't know when we're very slow to learn that, but our great amenity, our great thing is water, and it's something we have to protect at all costs.
So as you were out of the community and came back once a year, how did you first become aware that there was a controversy surrounding the pollution of White Lake?
Well, because it goes back to old Nan Taylor down in Maple Grove, Bob Wesley's grandmother. I would go down and see Bob Wesley. He was an old family friend, and so when he did the fishery out there at Clear Springs, we had torn down an old barn and back, and Dad gave a bunch of lumber to Bob, and he helped to build a building out there at Clear Springs where he had the fishery. And then you would check in with Bob, and he would tell you what's going on, and then slowly, I didn't really know Wint Dahlstrom then, but somehow Bob would say what's going on and how things were going and et cetera. And then also there was the great nutrient feed which was coming down the river, and that was like from the Narrows on up, was sort of like a weed bed. And what are we going to do about that, et cetera. And that's what's kind of fun, because there's a letter that I wrote here. I was back here in 1968. I wrote a letter, Dear Governor Romney, and basically was saying, about the lake, et cetera, and what's going on. And then that was in September of 1968, and obviously those plants had been going since '52. And so I get a reply back from the state of Michigan, signed by George Romney, the governor, and it's basically they're talking about the nutrients, et cetera, and there's basically the White Lake problem, as you know, is essentially one of over-nutrification of water and weeds and algae. It's exceedingly complex due to high contribution of nutrient materials from White River. And basically what this is saying in 1985, there's not one mention of chemical pollution. And,
wait a minute, 1985 or 1968?
This is 1968.
68.
Yeah.
Okay.
Roger, did you, I know Bob Wesley was initially concerned with the nutrient input from the tannery, and then the city of Whitehall's municipal wastewater facility.
Upstream, right, yeah.
And are you familiar with anything he did relating to that?
Well, basically, what he and I think Wint, his buddy, they basically made the community aware that it's not all roses, and that what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with it? And then I don't think Montague got a sewer system until about the 1970s, and so one doesn't want. And Buttermilk Creek basically was a drain, and
Yeah, they may have been connected to Whitehall for a certain
No.
time.
It was independent, and that's where Whitehall's sort of always been 3 steps ahead of Montague when it comes to water, sewer, and things like that. But Montague caught up.
So, at first your focus was on the nutrient and what pollution, what that was doing to the lake.
That's what Governor Romney says, yeah.
When did you become aware of a larger chemical problem?
Oh, because when you would go down, like if you were here and you're going down to Lloyd's Landing to go swimming, you would drive by Hooker, and you would notice that the white pines are turning yellow, and why are they turning yellow? Or the smell. When I lived in Muskegon, when I mentioned I lived down in Bluffton, I had to go to work. I had to drive by the paper mill every day. And quite frankly, you'd go by Muskegon Yacht Club, take a deep breath, and wouldn't, have another breath until you got on the other side of the paper mill. It was horrendous, and basically blighted that whole neighborhood, Lakeside, for years and years and years. And it's also kind of curious because, like the tannery, we haven't said much about the tannery. The tannery starts out basically, with hides, and then also using hemlock chips, all right? Hemlock chips were used in the tanning process, which there are a lot of hemlocks around here. And so the process kind of continues on a very organic kind of thing until at some point in time they stop doing that process and go to a more chemical process. And it's the same thing that happened kind of with Hooker. They start out taking salt, chlorine, sodium chloride, etc. And then at some point in time, like about, I think it was 52 they started, and about 55 they switched to C56, which gets to be a rather hideous situation. And but at that point in time, everything is kind of cooking. Everybody has jobs. These people certainly are not lying to us, and everything is going to be fine. And then there's Bob and Wint, and they're out there saying, "Hey, it's not all a chocolate factory,"
Mm-hmm. It sounds like visually awareness of the environment was really powerful for you. Were there any other visual cues other than the pines being bleached out or the smells? Was there anything else?
Well, there's some incidents where basically I think they blew a whistle once, and there was a chlorine escape, and people have talked about that. I mean, I wasn't here, but supposedly the chlorine, the kids were dismissed from school and things like that, and fortunately, I mean, the prevailing wind northwest or southwest, it doesn't really hit this portion of Montague, and it would be downwind. Like, friends who live along there by the timbers said, they would come back, summer people, they would come back and there'd be dead trees. And so basically they would say the dead trees are there, they're pine, they're oak, etc. And Hooker would pay to take them down.
Really?
So they knew things were going on.
So, when did you become emotionally involved in all of this as something that really needed remediation? Was it when you moved back here, or was it before that?
Well, actually, I suppose, like contrary to some of the other people which have been interviewed, I wasn't emotionally involved because basically I wasn't living here. And you were just aware of the stories when you came back, and then it depended on who you talked to. There would be, some people would say, oh, there's no problem at all, and other people would say, there's really something going on. And who's being honest, who's being dishonest, really what's it all about? And I I found these, I'm a hopeless kind of junker, all right? And so you go to an estate sale, and Evelyn Nordoff, the old real estate agent in town, was a guy named Fred Nordoff, had a daughter, Evelyn, and she ended up being sort of a janitor, caretaker person for the Hooker plant, etc. And so I went to her estate sale over there on Dowling Street, and so here was a picture of the architect's rendering of the Hooker plant, which I thought was interesting. And then basically there's the flyover of actually as constructed of the Hooker plant. And, it was a big deal, and obviously everybody was going to live happily forever. And then also there's like Hilltop News. I mean, it was amazing what happened, because basically it says the Hilltop News, published monthly by the First Methodist Church, corner of Church and Meade Streets, Montague, Michigan. And the introduction said, this issue is dedicated and compiled solely to express our appreciation to Hooker Electrochemical Company, not only for helping put us on the map, but for the many years of affiliation we hope to have. The people of Montague are humble and proud that we are to have the opportunity. It is our sincere that you like Montague, and it goes on and on and on, and then it's amazing. And then there's the Howard, Adolph Anderson, and Mrs. Anderson. She was an old Ripley from the corner over there, and then the effect of Axel Johnson was the town assessor. There's a whole article here on Dowie, because they had Dowie Point. An interesting thing was that they originally wanted, when Hooker came to town, they wanted to build the plant like on the water, because they wanted to have water access. And so they did have shipping access down below. But basically, obviously some people, McFall, etc., said that, this is not a good idea to put this kind of a plant directly on the water. And so there was a lawsuit. And that kind of gets back to this. Summer people or chemical industry. Then arose a major difficulty, one which took 6 months to solve. The resort business was the principal source of income to the town. The pleasant shores of White River and White Lake were so desirable. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. And so they were basically responsible for making Hooker build the plant on the inland side of Old Channel Trail versus directly on the water. And that Dowie Point now basically is where the percolation, what are the test wells, what do they call them?
that's the purge wells.
Purge wells,
that
right.
actually
Right.
capture
Right.
and end up providing it to a
Yeah.
treatment facility, so
And
it's
is
not
that
contaminated.
For Hooker or
For Hooker.
DuPont?
That's Hooker Chemical.
So the purge wells are up on the bluff, whereas before, the plant would have been up on the bluff, and the purge wells would have been down in the marshland. But just different stories about different properties, Evelyn Nordoff, how the town felt, early maps, things like that. The article in Audubon I thought was rather revealing. I know it's kind of boring to read things, but this is the one where basically they kind of realize that something's got to be done, and they come up with the vault, all right? And that it says Montague and the Temple of Doom. This is from the Audubon, 1985. I think it was, what Margaret, we said it was, it's on something.
September 1985.
September 85, okay. A massive pyramid enclosing 1 million cubic yards of toxic chemical waste rises near the shore of Michigan's White Lake, an everlasting reminder of how one community traded its clean, safe environment and pleasant wooded lake for an expanded tax base, 100 jobs, and deadly poisons in its air and water. And actually, they said this is something like the size of something like, I wrote it down here. The base is 800 feet square. It's the size of 14 football fields. And that's the Temple of Doom. And, I sometimes feel like we all should go out and walk around it about every 3 years as a reminder of what's out there. And it's not something that's disappeared. It's there. And in this Audubon article, there's cross sections, etc. It's built like an Aztec temple with different layers, etc. And it's amazing, etc. Then there's also early publications that sort of say how Hooker was going to make things, and the process of the Montague plant. When you go down to Medbury Park, you cross the bridge, and you see a whole line of concrete things that are along the wall, the property that Larry Brand had. Those are all Hooker cells, and supposedly they're also along White River down by the Dog and Suds, which have maybe been coated over. But basically, just kind of the process of how it all works, etc. And then the important thing is that we are 20% of the world's fresh water supply here, the Great Lakes system, and that, as Tanya knows from working with the Lake Michigan Federation, that we have to protect the water because we don't live without water. In 1956, this is in the beginning, it's basically an article about Wall Street from the Wall Street Journal. 2 Michigan villages sitting on salt boom as industries move in. Montague, Whitehall, wrestle parking, housing problems, but keep a small town pace. And so everything from like the Wall Street Journal, etc., covered the idea of this booming town. And there's going to be Hooker, DuPont, Union Carbide, and even mention of Goodyear Rubber. And that's all going to happen here. And I think, the curious thing is that I was reading in one of the clippings in that book there, where Art Myers is drilling a well for Mrs. Lau down at Indian Point, and they decide that they would send some maps back to Hooker, charts showing where this is located, etc. But like at one point in time, Hooker was even considering like Indian Point to be a site for the plant. And so you think of a plant that basically maybe takes like 10, 20 acres. DuPont ends up owning something like 1,033 acres in White River Township. Why does somebody need 1,000 acres when your plant is only going to be on a 10 or 20 acre site? And the answer is probably buffer, and or land speculation, one or the other. And so. And then that leads to another thing from a city planning point of view, is that, when you leave Montague city limits down at Whitbeck and you drive down, you ride your bike or whatever, you go down to Lloyd's Landing to Lake Michigan Beach, you go through the woods, it's woods all the way. And from the 1950s on, that property's all been owned by the chemical plants. and very few private parcels. The lakeside, yes, and that somehow, it almost ended up being kind of a love-hate thing, because basically, while you hate the pollution, etc., you love the idea that somehow there's still the woods and the tranquility. That land probably would have been subdivided during the the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, etc., and somehow it's still a great deal of open space and just kind of wooded lands. And is it tainted? I don't know. They've done studies on the plumes and things like that as to where they're going, and it's rather sensitive as to where they're going and how they're recapturing things. I went to a meeting a while back in White River Township, and they still have a great amount of acreage zoned for chemical plants. I mean, they have 165 acres for chemical industrial zoning. It's basically DuPont and the lime specialties. And so one would ask, why would you still have land zoned for a chemical plant in White River Township when you know what it might bring? And, it's a good question for the White River Board. I don't know if people realize that or not.
One thing that I have heard said in past years is that there is at least a small silver lining to both the chemical companies, in that, similar to what you said about the open spaces, that they preserved quite a bit of the shoreline, which may have been built on if it had been in private hands. And actually both the shoreline properties are pretty clean.
Well, the one shoreline property, actually, I mentioned to the board out at White River, was that from Long Point. Long Point is an amazing piece of property for aquatic and wildlife refuge, etc. And so, basically from Long Point all the way down to San Juan, there's a big hunk of land there. And, in my mind, matter of fact, I asked them if they could just kind of color it green and give it to the Land Conservancy or things like that. And there was a lot of hesitation, and I don't understand why.
Well, the township can't give it to the Conservancy, but the DuPont has been asked numerous times to turn it over to local authorities or to the Nature
Or put a conservation easement on it,
Yeah.
just leave it.
Yeah, and it's still in process. There's
Right.
there are still some occasional forays to ask DuPont that question.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about the city planning aspect and what you noticed about the changes in the community, as far as, first you have a low population and then you have all these jobs and the companies, and how did you see things changing in the community itself? Do you think it was impacted very much, or just out there where the plants were?
Well, the industrial aspect all happened out there. I mean, it did not happen in the city of Montague. It was all like in Montague Township and White River Township. And so, they got the tax base. The city of Montague didn't get the tax base. And that also, they did help. One of these articles refers to the new school building. And that somehow, they did help the school board mouth school in White River Township, the high school here, etc. So, as far as the education system goes, that helped a great deal with the tax base. I think the miracle about White Lake, basically, is that it hasn't changed that much. You drive down Old Channel Trail here, and it's basically, it's like 1941. The old trees are gone, there's new trees, etc. But, the woodland across the street is still the woodland, etc. And then Margot, okay, you're part of that compound out there in Lake Michigan kind of thing. And so there has been, when I was a child, there was Medbury Park, Lloyd's Landing, Grace Landing, and Houston's Landing, which is Minot Park. There was nothing in between. And so, if you wanted to have a beach party, you just go out there and just do it, And whereas now, I'll say every 100 feet, there's a house, there's a well, there's a septic system, etc. along the shore. And so, the shoreline, basically, which was the throwaway land to begin with, because you couldn't farm it, you couldn't raise anything on it, is now sort of the scenic wonderland overlooking Lake Michigan. And so, we're kind of the abandoned urban areas, the old towns, etc., where the townships have had the growth. You take Indian Point, that was the old Lau estate, and that was subdivided by the Hall family in the 1950s. And I suspect a lot of people there originally worked at Hooker. They were product of the Hooker money, etc., or the DuPont money, that kind of thing.
Were there any changes from a social or cultural or kind of a demographic? Because I know that quite a few people initially came to work for Hooker Chemical from the New York plant.
I was just here during the construction time,
Oh.
But I think also I did hear, okay, those people integrated. They joined the school system. They might even been on the Board of Education kind of thing. Obviously participated in the PTA. They belonged to local churches, and they integrated in the community. And they were, considered to be sort of the intelligent people who'd been around the block and added, more depth to the community.
When you served on the Montague City Council, did your feelings change at all about this whole story?
Okay, I spent 8 years in the Montague, the Council, the Planning Commission, Downtown Development Authority. And I think if there's anything that comes out in this whole story, it's basically what happens when people speak out. And when people don't speak out, things don't happen. And so that's where, almost like the martyrs of Wint and Bob Wesley, etc., and those early people, Mary Mahoney and people who somehow, the whistleblowers, and that somehow, in small towns, it's very difficult for people to speak out because, I don't know, this affiliation, that affiliation, you own the hardware store, you do this or whatever you do, etc. And so, people will end up down at the coffee house or something, and they'll be there and they'll talk about this every morning, kind of think about whatever. But do they come to a city council meeting and say something? Probably hardly ever. And then oddly enough, when you do go to the city council, like in the early days of Ellenwood and also the more recent, the Ravenswood thing, basically the council sort of flipped you off and voted the other way anyway. So do you participate or don't you participate? But basically, if there's anything we learn in our democracy, our plutocracy democracy, is that somehow you need the force of the people behind you to somehow make something happen. And so, why did it take so long for the DEQ, DNR, etc., to move in and say something's wrong at Hooker? And that somehow, there's the reviewing people who have the responsibility to say or do something. They're not saying anything because somehow they don't want to offend the industry. I don't know where the political contributions come from or go, etc. But basically, until the people start speaking out, the same old scenario kind of happens. And so, fortunately, in the end, the momentum gained, and they really realized that there were things that were happening that shouldn't have been happening, and so things changed. But on the city council, I think everyone basically has a responsibility to serve on a city council. And or to give something to the community. Like Dad was mayor, my mother was a school teacher, we have an obligation to. I spent 6 years working in Sacramento. I started under Governor Reagan, ended up under Jerry Brown. Interesting transition, and we got involved. We started the Sacramento City Association. We got a lot of historic preservation work going, and a lot of inner city things. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to downtown Sacramento in the last couple of years. What happened in downtown Sacramento is amazing. And, Governor Reagan sort of ignored the capital area plan. If something was wrong, they'd bulldoze a building and make a parking lot for suburban people. Jerry Brown did the opposite, had Sim Vanderin as a state architect come in, a lot of green architecture. And downtown Sacramento is it's incredible what happened. I bought an old Victorian house there. There's a picture of it over there, kind of thing, and did the old sweat equity number, buy low, sell high, and it was an interesting time. But they were like 6 years in Sacramento, just kind of being involved. And what was interesting was that basically, as a city planner, I mentioned I worked for the city of Muskegon when there still was a city of Muskegon, and then worked for a private planning consultant in San Francisco down in Maiden Lane. And we did master plans, and it was back when a lot of planning was like land use planning, and so we did Sonoma, California, the Sonoma Valley, beautiful area, General Vallejo and things like that, Half Moon Bay, Raton, New Mexico, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Los Alamos, New Mexico is kind of fascinating because basically Los Alamos is started by a guy from Detroit, and the big lodge was basically Grand Rapids money when it was a public school, and people don't know that, and so you did that early private planning, and then I went to work for Marin County Planning Department across the bay in San Francisco. Lived in Mill Valley, had a house in Mill Valley, and great spot, kind of dreamland actually. You roared off to work and with a top-down kind of thing, and office was a wonderful Frank Lloyd Wright Civic Center, a beautiful building in San Rafael. And so then at county level, then you worked at state level, and it's interesting because the more state level gets into more policy, legislation, supportive legislation, etc., and you're further away from the grassroots. And when I worked in Sacramento, we were saying, I wonder what they're doing in the trenches. And the trenches basically are local city halls, and that's where it all kind of starts. And then the other thing has happened from the state level. The state level is always trying to enact something which makes the locals do something that they may want to do or not want to do. And so there's always this tug and pull between local power and state power, and then even now it gets into sort of federal power. If the feds do this, assisted suicide or something like that, can you do it or can't you do it? Gay marriage, whatever you want to get into kind of thing. These are things that come down from the top, or they filter up from the bottom. Being on city council is a very interesting thing. Everybody should do it.
Can I follow up on that?
Tanya's doing it.
What? Two questions actually. What years did you serve on the council? From when to when?
Oh, it was 1991 to 1998.
Okay, and then how did your job or your role as a landscape architect, or did it influence how you viewed the pollution issues in White Lake and how people reacted?
Oh, sure, yeah, especially city planning. Things don't have to be this way, and citizen, participation is a big element in city planning. Do we want or don't we want? And I mean, every time we would go into Sonoma, we ended up calling, there was a lady, we called her the prune orchard lady. And every time you did a road or a major street or we're going to color a different zoning pattern, she'd stand up there and point, what's going on with my property. And if there's anything I learned during those days is that, like, if you go to a public hearing, it's interesting who stands up and says what, because basically it always relates back to the ownership of property. And if you are very curious about, you get a plat map and find out land ownership patterns, and then you can just, exactly who's going to say what in relation to a public hearing. It's fascinating.
Then you have the added dynamic of the summer people and the year-round people here, and who will say what given when they're here.
Well, unfortunately, the summer people are kind of locked out because, they pay taxes here, but they don't vote here. And there's 3 generations of families who have been here, coming, from great-grandparents kind of time. They're kind of locked out of the process. They certainly do come to the meetings, and every once in a while will say something, but then often, maybe if you're trying to do something, you try to plan the meeting what happens during the winter and not during the summer. And it's rather devious.
Well, and two, if you look at those people who did speak out, we did have local residents that lived here who spoke out. So even though there may have been, a little bit more concern on the summer people's part, it did fall to the local residents to raise the issues.
I think it's a more, the more questioning people. You have to question, and if you don't question, nothing happens. You question their responses, and then you go from there. Excuse me.
I wonder what you think of White Lake as a lake, its health at this time.
Well, it's interesting. I went to a White Lake PAC meeting recently, and they had the 3 kids who they had tested all the tributaries, Buttermilk Creek, Coon Creek, Wildcat Creek, etc. And where, the phosphorus and this and that, what's in the water. It was very interesting to watch because the teacher was great, and the kids were enthused. And one of the questions I asked when it was over, when they through the presentation, like, question, do you swim in White Lake, or would you swim in White Lake? And there was no reluctance at all about saying, yes, we swim in the White Lake. It's fine. And and that goes back to sort of like when I went to college. I ended up being a lifeguard for a while at the Lansing Whie or something, and you got your Red Cross water safety instructor certificate, so you could teach swimming, and so Montague had White Lake, the Rotary Club had a program, was like Learn to Swim, and they had a dock down at Maple Grove Beach, and the dock was there, and also there was a raft. And that's like when I was a kid, the game was the dock, then you have to swim out to the raft, hang around the raft, etc. And you're kind of like a bunch of whales, sort of sunning yourself on the raft. And but the swim program sort of went on. But when the lake started getting yucky, the program kind of stopped. And I ran across something the other day, and there were some pictures where basically they took the program and went out to Whitney's Pool out there in Pine Brook, and continued the swim things there. And so when I asked those kids, do they swim in White Lake, I was kind of curious because I thought, maybe it's time to restart the Rotary Learn to Swim program, whether it's a dock at Maple Grove Beach or whatever. And that, earlier, like last spring, you read where, two high school boys basically were swimming across Duck Lake and they drowned. And you think wait a minute, we should learn how to swim and get out there in the water and participate.
Wasn't Buttermilk Creek the source of that pool, though? And you talked about Buttermilk Creek being used as sort of...
Buttermilk Creek above where Pine Brook was just basically open farmlands. And it's when you got further down into town that it may have become sort of a problem.
Oh, okay. So you talked about what the kids thought of White Lake's health at this time, but you didn't really say what you think about it.
Oh, I think it's much improved. But there are still things that sort of raise questions when you go to a meeting, and DuPont, I think they said, they refer to the mixing area, and you think, what is a mixing area? And somehow the mixing area is in that bay by Long Point. I don't know what, it's always pure as a driven snow kind of thing. But also I've noticed for the last couple summer seasons that Long Point is a great sandbar that comes out there, and it's like people, you with your children, etc., will basically, you can jump off the boat, you're up to your knees, and so there's a whole clustering of boats there, and you want to say, knock, knock, do you know that this is a mixing area? And the answer is, I may be totally wrong. Maybe it's pure water. I have no idea. But just the word mixing area. The same thing as, with the DuPont pipe that goes into Lake Michigan. What is that? Who's monitoring that? Who's watching that? When the northwest winds are blowing down to Lloyd's Landing, you're swimming there. Obviously, what's coming out that pipeline is coming down your direction. So, it's questionable.
What overall impact do you feel the chemical manufacturing era had on the White Lake area?
Well, I think it helped a lot of growth. I mean, you go through different areas of town, and you could just see the houses owned up during the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. Prior to then, it was like when the lumber industry was over. I mean, this house is a product of the lumber industry, Samuel H. Lasley, and when the lumber industry was over, what do you do? And it seemed like anybody who had a big old Victorian house started renting rooms to people from Chicago. And then the Goodrich lines came up during the 30s, the Georgia, the Carolina, etc., and to deposit, the tired, the poor, the masses from Chicago. And so you turned your house into a boarding house, and then maybe each year you bought an additional cottage or something, or built an additional cottage. And then you end up having a lakeside inn, Catalpa Resort, an Idlewild, a White Lake Villa. And prior to then, when the lumber industry was gone, what did you do? And there was, the tourism was slowly evolving, but basically, the men worked on the Great Lakes. There was you worked in shipping. You worked in, the expression was, you worked on the boats. and you worked on the boats, ore carriers, etc. On the Great Lakes, and that was a seasonal thing. So I suppose you'd be going from maybe April through November, and hopefully off the water by November, because that's when the storms kicked in.
What about you talked about the positive impact? Is there any negative impact on the area from the chemical manufacturing area?
Oh yeah, the images for a long, long time. Yeah, I mean, we talked about swimming in White Lake. Why would you want? Why would you want to do that? I mean, a funny thing the other day, a while back actually, Clayton Klein, an old friend, left some money for a soccer field out here. And he had a buddy, Jim Tanis. Jim Tanis is great for, eulogies and things like that. And so he was a buddy. They were classmates. They were going to hike around Lake Michigan one time as kids. And so I got together with Jim saying, we should ask White River, actually it's, Montague Township, about the play field, the soccer field that they're doing out there. And so there's a little stretch, and it says somehow there's no mention, a little mention of Clayton Klein, who somehow came up with a lot of the money. And also then Hooker, Oxy, gave the land. And so we were sort of doing an idea, we'll call it the Clayton Klein, well actually we have to include Oxy, and so we thought we'll call it the Clayton Klein Oxy Chemical Playfield. And then as soon as you throw in the last part, it's like, do you really want your children to play there? Obviously, the answer is the land is pure. It really wasn't tainted, etc. And Oxy is to be thanked for donating the land along with Clayton, because it's a very successful kind of soccer playfield now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a bad image. There was a bad image for a long time.
So, about lessons that the community has learned from this. Positive, do you think? Negative?
Speak out. You have to question, and that gets against maybe economic interests, and you have something which makes you money, and all of a sudden I'm saying, hey, that they're polluting, and you say, but we need their money, and there are the trade-offs, and that. From I go back to the city planning point of view. That's the trade-off that happens consistently and constantly. You have to weigh this against that, and are we really proud to have a Temple of Doom? The size of 14 football fields out there festering, being treated, and then the question is also those plumes. So they're running them through carbon, and how long does that go on? And then the other thing is that somehow there seems to be, in the past, once again, Tanya was involved in Lake Michigan Federation, water, basically the waterways were the sewer system. That's why industry located along the shore. And, Muskegon's done a wonderful job of cleaning up the shoreline and realizing that, water is a great important resource and it's something to be protected. But, in days past, whether it's the settling ponds on the water side of the tannery, so if something got in the lake, so what, but obviously we have a whole different attitude towards water and the preservation of water and the conservation of water, and it all comes from speaking out. It's one of those lessons that has to be taught again and again and again. Tax basis versus environment, and I often feel like, the Indians were so wise because the land sort of became kind of like a holy land. And, you could almost smell the earth and the way they regarded earth, and that somehow, our attitude towards earth is basically, it's just a product to be ripped and torn and bulldozed. And we're all going to go off and live in the sky in the end kind of thing, and be happy ever after. But basically, we really have to focus on planet Earth, or we're in deep trouble.
Could you talk a little bit about your kayaking on the lake now and share the positives about that?
Oh, it's great fun. I keep it down at a friend's boathouse, and I have a Sunday morning ritual. You somehow watch Meet the Press, and then something else, and then you have to make a dash down before the waves come up if you want to paddle across the lake. And what's interesting is that by now you kind of know almost everybody around the lake, and so you'll be. I've kayaked with Tanya, for instance. Said, "What am I going to do for the sesquicentennial?" And I said, "We will do a kayak tour of Whitehall's historic waterfront." And we launched. She wanted to put it in Whitehall. I said, we'll lose them if we put them in the river, so we have to put them in Montague. But then that's not Whitehall. Those kind of discussions. Anyway, so we put in Maple Grove Park. Oh, we had 25 kayaks and one canoe, and we paddled over to the Tannery and did a song and dance about the evolution and the cleanup of Tannery Bay, and then paddle along the waterfront, up the bridge into the bayou, into the marsh, etc. Swans, whatever, and then paddled back, and it was a wonderful afternoon, and I think people did get a lot out of it, and so you paddle along, and the thing about a kayak is no one hears you coming, and so you're fishing or you're working on a boat at the end of a dock, and all of a sudden you're there in their face, and like, where did you come from? And actually I have a situation where basically. I have friends down at the other end of the lake, McGee's down at Murray's, and I will paddle down. You're doing things during the day, and it's 4:30, and you think like, oh gosh, I should get out in the water, and so you'll paddle, very quickly down to the other end, go swimming. They offer you a gin and tonic, stay around for dinner, whatever. It's just we have different spots around the lake, which good chums.
Wow. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think basically, what I started with is that the slow evolution of this was the greatest thing that ever happened, and then it did happen. Everyone was happy, and then at some point in time, things turned, and people didn't want to believe it, and maybe they were lied to. The enforcing agencies, which should have done things earlier and sooner, didn't do, and so finally, the cleanup comes, and yes, the lake was tainted, and there were some bad times, but I think now that, that's over, we're kind of back on track, but the same scenario exists. It could start again tomorrow with an announcement of something happening, and, will they do it or won't they do it? And it's like tax base, incomes. I mean, it just seems that, having worked in city planning and also been in a city council, that all you have to do is walk into a city council and say, we're going to spend $30 million, we're going to create 300 jobs, we're going to increase your tax base, job base, etc. And it's almost like a given. And you have to, that's where the citizens really have to weigh, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And that'll happen continuously.
Well, thank you very much, Roger.
Really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Okay, I should also say, like, at one point in time when the Ellenwood thing was going on, there was Henry Rossler, Mayor Henry, Marietta Paul, Pat Finland, myself. We were rather disturbed about the way things were going. There'd be a room filled with people, and the previous council would say, okay, we approve your plans, Mr. Developer. And we didn't understand that, and so that's when the four of us thought, okay, we will run for city council. I was living in California then. I had registered to vote here, though. And so four of us ran for city council, and that's when you were elected. And actually, then I called friends in California, and they said, how'd the election go? And I said, I won. And they said, when are you coming back? And I said, well, gee, I kind of have to be here. And then the response was, you call that winning? It was nasty.